Welcome to No Question About That. Today with Andy Slater from the Barmy Article to talk about Manchester United women. Andy, how's it going?
It's going good. We had a recent blip football-wise, but we picked up again in the last match.
Yeah.
So all of your listeners will know that that kind of dominates how your personal life goes. So it's well based on the last performance.
Yeah, very good. Solid win over Aston Villa last time out. A surprising defeat to Liverpool at Anfield. Yes. Big crowd and all of that. So not particularly good side, Liverpool women, but managed to come out on top. Only the second defeat this season. So I wanted to get into that because I'm always, as a someone who's watching from a distance, literally and metaphorically with the United women's side, I don't get to the games. You do. The fan sentiment online is quite negative around United, I would say, United women, and the results have not been. I mean, it's been a reasonably strong performance this season. So how are you feeling about things?
Positive at the moment. First half of the season, leading up to the winter break, we got results, but we were quite poor a lot of the time. There were a couple of results that we did fall short in. Drawing against Brighton, for example, that was a key one. We were poor against Villa at Leigh Sports Village. Some others where we did get the result, but we were way under par on performance. Palace away, for example, we were pretty terrible, but we won 1-0, which is a sign of a good side, as the old cliche goes. But it was worrying going into the second half of the season, and we faced City, first league game back after the winter break. So those performances did worry us, even though the points were kind of there. But since the winter break, we just hit the ground running. Seemed to tweak the system, really positive. We had a good starting 11, what I think is our best starting 11, which for me has to include Hinata Miyazawa. And we went on a really good run of performances as well as results, which included beating City in the league, put us comfortably above them in league positions for the top three. So the season really did turn positive. Like you say, you mentioned Liverpool. That one was a bit of a freak result in the run of games that we'd had. But overall, with the win since then, it's really positive. We've got a cup semi-final to come, and we're in a really good position for the Champions League places.
Yeah, top three qualify for the Champions League. 7 points ahead of City at the moment with, 5 games to go? Is it 5? Something like
5.
That. Yeah. So, looks like it'll be a playoff, won't it, again? I think, unless the Champions League format's been tweaked. I know there's been a lot of talk about that.
The qualification, I don't think, is going to be too dissimilar, but the main difference is those that drop out of the qualifiers for the Champions League go into the Europa Cup. So there will be European football next season for the top 3 sides. Last time we qualified, it was a 2-legged knockout, which we lost, and then that was it. European dream over. But this time, in men's football terms, it's the consolation, it's a distraction. But for a team that's played 2 European football matches, just having European football will be exciting. Obviously, we want the Champions League and we believe we're capable, but just having European football will be good for the fans to experience, but also when you're trying to attract new players, you can offer them more than potentially just 2 legs of a qualifier. So hopefully it'll go in our favour in that sense as well.
Yeah, interesting developments in the women's game overall, aren't there? I mean, obviously a lot more money in the Super League now with the new TV contract. There's some debate about that one and whether some parties there regret it. That's a different question, I guess. But more money, attracted more players. The budgets for the teams are going up. I had a look at this actually, and United, we're actually spending a lot of money in women's football terms and have been superseded by Chelsea, Arsenal and City now in terms of budget. So it's still at about 5 million United women's budget, and that's some way behind Chelsea, who generate lots and lots of revenue, although it's all a bit muddled, isn't it? Because there's this cross sponsorship from the men's team. How much do you apply? And it's an argument I've been making. Not that Sir Jim will listen because he's an old misogynist, but it wouldn't take very much to massively boost United's budget if there's a bit of ambition. I mean, hardly anything at all, basically. So that gets into like the ownership a little bit. How are we feeling about that? Because he's kind of... So Jim's out there and talking, which is more than the Glazers ever did. I mean, one of the Glazers' first acts was to axe the women's team, so we won't give them any flowers at all. But Sir Jim doesn't half sound like an old dinosaur when talking about the women's team. Were you more encouraged with the recent round of media interviews? It didn't seem to move on much.
I think it's discouraging what he says about the women's team often. But I think the bigger picture is what he says about the club and its staff outside of football. I think, the attitude to women's football is one thing, but the way he's running the club is a much bigger deal and affects everybody.
Yeah.
Ultimately, I think what Ineos are doing will bring improvements in the long term. And I think he'll use that to justify what he's doing at the club. But I think his treatment of staff in general, if businesses have to make redundancies sometimes, but you don't have to be evil about it.
Yeah.
You don't have to create the hostile environment to encourage people to leave of their own accord so that you don't have to spend money on getting rid of them, while still spending millions on hiring and firing people you should be doing your due diligence on at the top end of the club.
Well, quite, yeah.
So I think it's the attitude towards the women's team from Jim. I'd like to see it better, but ultimately, if he just stays out of the way, I don't care if he cares, as long as he lets the women's team be the women's team with its own budget, with its own structure, whatever. We've got Omar Barada, who has a track record of running the club with a relatively successful women's team. Dan Ashworth's loss was a bit of a blow to that because he's obviously supported women's football in his previous roles.
Yeah.
But I'm not worried about the future of the women's team. I think given the license to do what they do, they've already recruited very well, despite some poor seasons and poor PR around the club as a whole. So there is a structure there that works to some degree.
Mm.
And it's proven this season that, some of the players that have come in and some of the players that we've got for the future, we don't look in too bad a shape for now and the next season and the season after. So it's about optics, I think.
It's a pretty young side, isn't it? And the recruitment one was interesting because obviously, Dan Ashworth was a big sort of supporter of the United women's team, and in previous cases, Omar Barada says the right things, but Polly Bancroft hasn't really properly been replaced. So she moved over to Grimsby to become CEO there. I think there's still temporary acting director, general manager type role in place. It's not been made permanent.
Matt Johnson's still in place. Harvey Bussell's head of recruitment and has been doing, had a good few transfer windows. So it'd be nice to see all that made permanent and know where we are in the long term. But certainly in the short term, I don't think there's... What frustrates me about the comments around where Jim says we'll deal with the priority and then we'll deal with the women's team is if he just said the women's team is running quite well by itself right now, I'm not worried about it. That would be fine because it is.
Yeah.
It'd be nice to have a bigger budget, but we're doing okay. We're in a decent stadium, which feels like home to the regular match goers. We've got good recruitment. We've got a good squad. There are things that are going wrong. There are, players that move on and say certain things, which looks bad in a lot of ways and is some negatives around the structure of the club in itself. But overall, it looks very positive. Yeah,
the players that moved on in recent seasons, there were some big names. Alessia Russo, who's scoring goals at Arsenal. Mary Earps went to Paris Saint-Germain. There was a sense of negativity around that because there were big names. They're part of the Lionesses, they're part of the marketing of women's football generally. But they've been replaced. I mean, Turland scoring goals, lots of them. Fallon Tullis-Joyce is the best keeper in the league this season, at least. And So there's Dominique Jansen's come in, former Arsenal defender, of course, done really well, playing mostly midfield. Like, we're feeling pretty positive about the recruitment into the women's side.
Yeah. Fallon Tullis-Joyce, who you mentioned, she was in place 6 months in advance of Mary Earps leaving.
Yeah.
It felt like she was too good to be on the bench when she was, and once that January window passed and Earps hadn't left or extended, I would have played Fallon Tullis-Joyce from that point onwards until Mary Earps either left or signed. Mary got an FA Cup medal, which was nice to have that with the growth that she'd done with the team. But Fallon was a ready-made replacement. And I think sometimes from the outside, people look at a player leaving and demand a replacement after the fact, not looking who's already there in advance. Turland as well. She came after Russo had left, so that wasn't there in preparation. But I'm happier with Turland than I was with Russo. I think we get more consistency out of Turland. Obviously, Russo's doing well now, but it felt like at United, I don't think she's a number 9, and I think we had good forwards, wingers, and 10s without having a proper striker. And I think having Turland as a proper number 9 who presses relentlessly, she leads the line really well. Even when she's not scoring, she makes such a difference, especially when she's got the right players behind her to support the press. And that favourite 11 of mine that I mentioned, which includes Miyazawa, Toon in the 10, and then Turland up front, those 3 are a pressing machine.
Yeah.
And then you've got Bizet on the right wing, who, there's a lot of discourse around Jace at the moment, who I think was probably our most talented player, but didn't really improve the team. Whereas Bizet really fits in with the players around her and has a big impact. Galton on the left. Galton, I think, is one that we'll need to look at replacing soon, having somebody in place ready. I think you mentioned the Lionesses that left. I think that's where Garcia is probably a bigger loss than any of the names you mentioned, because she played on the left and she was, even when the team were down, she was one that was always up for it and dragged the team forward. So I think Galton's great. Garcia on the left as well would have been brilliant to still have. But we've got a real unit in the front half of the pitch, which works well together despite the big names that have gone.
So, Gaze, as you mentioned, a bit of controversy there. Social media posts saying how unhappy she was. They've arranged a loan to Gotham City in the NWSL. I think Garcia went to Mexican football, if I remember correctly. Yep. Big crowds there as well. NWSL, it's interesting actually, because the commentary over here, I'm listeners will know I'm based in Seattle, is everyone's very worried about the money in the WSL because they can outpay and outbid for players now, and that was the old power source, wasn't it? NWSL, where everyone wanted to play, and that's not necessarily true anymore. Celine Bizet, you mentioned, who's had a really good season for a young player, first season in English football. You see a lot of growth there and potential?
Yeah, I didn't really know anything about her when she was at Spurs. And it was, Grace Clinton came back from loan at Spurs with 1 year left on her contract plus a year option, which has been triggered. And it almost felt like they'd become best friends at Spurs. It almost felt like she was brought in as a sweetener for Grace Clinton to settle back at United. But while Grace Clinton's played well at times, there's been other times that she hasn't, and Bizet has really set the world alight, I would say. Like I say, I think she's not as talented as Jace, but she certainly has a much bigger impact on the team. She's a proper winger. She plays in front of Jade Riviere, who's a very progressive fullback.
Yeah. And
the right side looks very, very exciting when those two are on form. And then we've got the midfield that support and link it up well.
We talked a lot about the forwards. Really, the season's been built on the defence. Hardly any goals conceded. And very settled back four now that everyone's fit, because that hasn't always been the case, right? Gabby George spent a long time out injured. Riviere settled in at right back. Got Millie Turner and the captain, Maya. Why the fuck am I forgetting her name?
Letitia
at the back there. I mean, it seems like a really settled unit that's extremely effective.
Yeah, and it shows how settled it is when, Gabby George is a relatively recent signing. Missed almost a full season through an ACL injury, but she's a lifelong United fan, cousin of Jessie Lingard. She's played at Everton for a long time, but she's excited to play for United. And then the other three are all players who've recently signed extensions. Maya, she's the captain. For how young she is, she's very experienced. She spent 4 years at Brighton before United and played very regularly there. And now she's in her third season with us now, and she's captain. She's still early 20s, but she's signed a long contract. Millie's recently signed a long contract. She's been at United since they were reformed. And Jade Riviere, who, like you said, she came over from Canada. She seemed quite injury prone, but she's settled in now. She's had a good run of games and really contributed to the team. And she's recently extended as well. So, for all the negativity around not being able to keep all the big names, we've got some exciting young players who are committing the future to the club.
Yeah.
And doing really well in the first team along with it.
I want to talk a little bit about the crowd. So it's sort of settled at about 4,000 average gate at the moment. And do we think there's room for growth there? Because we look at especially when the teams playing the big stadiums, Arsenal have been very successful at playing about half their games at the Emirates and draw some really big crowds. We've seen in Spanish football, huge crowds at Camp Nou and so on. It's 4,000 the ceiling. What does that look like? Are we looking for more fans and supporters? Because that will change the nature of what the crowd is if United actually put some marketing muscle behind it and start filling the Sports Village.
Yeah, I think there's definitely room for more. But I think with the loss of the Lionesses, there was certainly a loss of fans. But I think it forces the club, whether they do it or not is another matter, but I think it should encourage the club to work on building a sustainable fan base. Because if you've got a big name Lioness, of course you're going to market it. But the fans you get from that will only last as long as that player does. Player FC, it has been a growing thing in men's football over the last 20 to 30 years that I've seen, but it's a very big thing in women's football, especially around the Lionesses. 10 years ago, 15 years ago, club football wasn't a big deal, so people followed England. People went to England matches to get the big fix of women's football. Otherwise, it was a few hundred at club matches. So people do have affinity with England rather than in men's football, where certainly as United fans, it was always anti-England because a lot of England fans were anti-United. In women's football, that's not so much the case. So international football does play a big part for the fan base. But I think what United are doing recruitment-wise that we've mentioned is getting good, exciting young players and developing them. And I think that should be the market around it. Come and join these exciting young players on their journey. We're a club that have always created legends rather than bought legends. We've had a good few big name signings in men's football, but we've always been about bringing young players up and turning them into, top professionals for the first team. And that's something that the women's team are doing.
Yeah.
Some of them will become Lionesses, such as May Letitia. Lots think she's a future captain for England. But we're taking young players and building them up. And if you can get fans to join that ride, instead of saying, look at this big name we've got who just won a Euros, that's a much more sustainable fan base to grow. It'd be great to see it jump from 4,000 to 8,000 on Sunday. But you always know that a lot of them aren't going to come back. So take it slow, build up a fan base that will be with us for a long time. And I think that's the way it doesn't need to jump into massive figures straight away. I think it's okay to take a bit of time about it and do it properly.
Yeah, I think sometimes we forget that this side is really only 7 years old.
Yeah.
And given that nature, it is Manchester United, so the expectations are high, always, as they should be. But 7 years old, pretty consistent. Last season was pretty poor, finishing fifth, but the FA Cup kind of added a gloss to that, for sure. Could be very good end to the season. So let's talk a little bit about that end to the season, because it's a super tough run in. You've got City in the Cup semi, then City again, Chelsea and Arsenal in the league in that run in. it could sort of make or break the season, really, those fixtures.
Yeah, I think this is where the loss against Liverpool recently was a big blow, because if we win that, which we really should have won that, then we're 10 points in front of City at the moment. We've got 2 games before that final running. We've got Everton, we've got West Ham, 2 games we should be winning. If we win them, we're 7 points ahead of City going into the final 3 games. That means avoid defeat against City and they can't catch us.
Yeah.
Even if we lost to Chelsea and Arsenal, avoid defeat against City and they will not catch us and get top 3, which is the goal at this point. Until that Liverpool loss, the league wasn't something on fans' minds very much, but it was in touching distance, depending on Chelsea's results. We were 5 points behind. They had the tough game against City, which they ultimately won in the league. They've won all the important games in this 4-match series that they've had in between Champions League, League Cup and a league match. But yeah, I remember we played City the first game back after winter, and then after that we had 8 games against the so-called lesser teams before this 3-game run-in. Now, you looked at the 8 games and my thought was, they are all games we should win. And if we perform well, we will win. We've done all but one of them, the Liverpool match. We've got 2 to go. So 5 out of 6 wins, 1 disappointing loss. But we're still, thanks to Chelsea's win against City the other day in the league, we've still got that 7-point cushion, which if we can hold that, we shouldn't fear any of Chelsea, Arsenal and City. We've got City coming up in a semi-final, which I'm going into confident. The league matches, I think we've got it. We're in a very strong position. And I think we should be looking at Arsenal at the Emirates the last game, even Chelsea at Leigh Sports Village. We should be looking at going and winning these games. We were tough to beat against Chelsea away this season when we were on poorer form, and they only beat us 1-0, and we came close to an equaliser. So I think we should be looking at a cushion ready for those last 3 games. But if that takes the pressure off, go and play what we can do against them, and we've got it in our locker to go and get a result against any of those 3.
Interesting time in women's football. I mean, both Arsenal and City swapped out their managers in the middle of the season, which is a little unusual. I mean, there's a lot of churn and change in women's football all the time anyway, in nature of things, shorter contracts and so on. But it's a little surprising they swapped the managers in mid-season, which tells you something about their performances, I guess. How is Marc Skinner doing? Because the online sentiment, as I started at the beginning of the show, is quite negative about him. And I asked around, and you ask people, and they're like, "Yeah, everyone hates him." And yet, the team doesn't feel like they hate him. So what's going on with Skinner?
So I think his first season was a settling-in season, and then his second season was brilliant. There were some things around the performances that you thought, there's a lot of last-ditch wins, and you think, we're riding our luck. Are we going to last the season and get the top 3? And we ended up 2 points off winning the league. Pushed Chelsea to a points total that would have, our points total would have won many of the seasons in the WSL. And you think, right, build on this. We've impressed. We've reached a cup final. We lost that one. Build on this. And the season after was so disappointing because it was a huge step backwards. And it wasn't just that we finished 4th outside of that top 3. We finished 5th, and Liverpool, who were a decent side that season, but definitely not a side that were knocking on the door of the top 3. So that was a pretty terrible league season, but we won the FA Cup. Now, at that point, I wouldn't have been disappointed if Skinner had gone. Depending on who else was out there, I think the FA Cup shouldn't have been enough to save his job. If that was the one thing that swung it, I think that's disappointing, because you've got to look at, I've always got to look at league performance. That's your bread and butter. That's what you've got to keep doing. You've got to keep knocking on the door of that top 3 to keep attracting the players that want to play in Europe. Then this season comes, he gets his 1 year, which in the circumstances of Ineos coming in, you kind of understand that they're not committing to him, but they're not prepared to make a big change. So I was glad it was only a year after that season's performance. But going off this season, when he's in the top three, and for a lot of the season relatively comfortably in the top three, how can you sack a manager like that?
Yeah.
It looks like we will get top three.
Yeah.
So how can you sack him at that point? Whether I think he's worth a 3-year contract or so this summer, I don't know. I think a lot of the fan sentiment is around a perceived relationship with players. Players that have moved on have said things about the club that they don't tend to thank the manager. But a lot of the players that have moved on have been moved on. The ones that have said that. And I think it's okay for players to be unhappy at not playing. That doesn't mean the manager's bad. The manager might not be great at managing a big squad or keeping players on the periphery happy because they might be needed. And I think there is something lacking in that sense. But the young players that have signed long contracts recently show that certainly isn't a widespread thing within the squad.
Yeah.
Ella Toon said something in an interview recently that was really positive about Marc Skinner. She's had some personal troubles this season, losing a dad, and she's had support from the club. And then you look at the Jace situation, who lost a brother and was allowed leave to go and be with the family at that time. But then there was all the stuff about trying to loan her out. And that feeds into the narrative that some people have already about Marc Skinner can't keep players happy. Now, apparently Jace's agent touted around all the news agents, all the newspapers to try and get that story out, and barely anyone would touch him. And then he got that out, and he's known as a pretty unsavoury character to work with. So I don't read much into United's, or at least Marc Skinner's behaviour in that situation. The club can do better and should do better in a lot of situations, but I think there are a lot of narratives that are stuck on agendas that won't move. And the thing is, he's done well enough a lot of times, but he's also been questionable enough to base him on merit. And on merit, I'm not convinced that he's the long-term future of Man United. I'm happy with him in the job right now, but you can judge him on his merit and still have enough to question and say, I don't like that. I think this should be better.
Well, he's out of contract in the summer, so there'll be a big question about whether they renew there or move on. And I guess we come back to that structure thing, really. Are the people who make the decision about hiring and firing the women's manager actually in place or not themselves? So there'll be a big summer all round for the club. Well, look, it's pretty positive. I mean, I encourage everyone to check out the last few games because it's going to go right to the wire in terms of United season. Should qualify for Europe, as you say. You really only need one positive result out of those last sort of big three.
Yeah.
And the FA Cup, 13th of April, the big semi-final. That'll be exciting. You going?
Yep, I've been lucky enough to get tickets. Unfortunately, it's at the Joy Stadium rather than the Etihad. So we were given 398 tickets as the away allocation. So it was 9 o'clock this morning, refreshing the screen. Season ticket priorities because there were so few tickets. But there will be plenty of Reds in the City end because they were on sale anyway. Yeah. So I've no doubt that the majority, well, maybe not majority, but a whole lot of the stadium beyond our block will be red. We beat them at the Etihad this season in the league. It's now a big occasion to go and beat them at the Joy Stadium in front of a much smaller crowd, but I'm sure it'll be quite intense in that small stadium.
Yeah, perhaps the surprise gets to do with fixture schedules and stuff like that. It's not at the Etihad. Before we go, big gyms, big tent. The new stadium suggestion is that Old Trafford will not be reduced to become the women's / academy stadium. That is going to be a bunch of apartment blocks by the looks of it. But Barada suggested a few times now that the women's team will also play at the big new stadium with, I don't know, some magical screens or something like that, helping to reduce the size and keep the atmosphere. How do you feel about that? Because I've been to some women's football games here at Seattle Reign. Play quite often in the big stadium. That's 70,000 capacity stadium with hardly anyone in it. Feels a bit weird. How do you feel about that?
I really liked the idea of the reduced Old Trafford, but obviously that's business. Flats are probably far more profitable for a club that's desperate for money than a reduced Old Trafford for sentimental reasons. If they do it properly, I've seen pictures of these screens that come out like a fake ceiling that hide the empty seats. And if it's done properly, then I would, as convenient as Leigh Sports Village is to me, where I live, I would love for United Women to be at a Manchester United home.
Yeah.
If possible. But it's got to be done properly because, the few games we have played at Old Trafford, the first few, there were decent sized crowds, big enough for the atmosphere to feel genuine. But the game this season was the start of the season, the first game in. It was 12,000 in Old Trafford. We all got shuffled around to the North Stand Tier 1 so that we were all on the TV cameras and it didn't look as empty. And it's, like you say, it's poor. And we see it. There are some women's teams that play all their games at the men's grounds. Leicester play at the King Power. And we went to Villa Park last weekend. And when you're looking at 3 empty stands, it feels poor.
Yeah.
It feels difficult to get the atmosphere up. So that's got to be done right. If it can be done right, I'd be delighted to be going to whatever the new ground's going to be called.
Yeah.
Every home game and make that our home.
The Ineos Bowl or something like that, it'll end up being called. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I mean, I go to our local semi-pro side. It's 2,500 people. You can get a great atmosphere in a small ground when it's full. And that would not sound the same in a 70,000 capacity ground. So
absolutely.
All right. Andy Slater, Barmy Article, check out the actual print magazine. I'm still amazed that you pulled this off. I know how much work that is. So congrats on that. You also have a podcast, which you should get out more regularly, Andy.
Yeah, it's hard getting people together to do, but we've done 2 since Christmas. We might do one next week in the winter break. Mm-hmm. Not winter break, the international break, sorry. But yeah, I do intend to. But there's some good content out there already. A couple of YouTube channels that get things out. There's some popular stuff which, if it's already there, I'm not going to compete with it. The print is the main thing, but where we can, we will get some more podcasts out.
Very good. Do it. Andy Slater, thank you very much.
Thank you.